So we have 3 readings today, and I don't know how much you've been able to do, of course, in this very short time, but I'll try to go over some of the connections I'm trying to make. Broadly, question is how law and politics change in their meaning in the age of imperialism, which is the convention is to understand the age of imperialism as ending with World War II. But of course, you can say that it doesn't quite end at that time. After that, it transforms into some, different modes of exercising power. But broadly, the argument I'm engaging mainly with Carl Schmitt. There's many people one can deal with, and Carl Schmitt, of course, has a lot of problems. Some of you may know. Carl Schmitt was a what's called a jurist, sort of scholar of law in Germany, and he was close friends with many members of the Frankfurt School. So he was in that sense, he straddled the political divide between left and right, but he also was, for some time, an enthusiastic supporter of the Nazi Party, like Martin Heidegger and other thinkers. So he's a figure who's complicated, to say the least. But in a way, his interest for us comes from the fact that he is a critic of liberalism. He is a critic of liberalism from a conservative standpoint, perhaps, but many of the criticisms that he makes of liberalism have found new relevance in the post-Cold War era. Okay, the era after 1990 or 91, whenever you Berlin Wall fell in end of 1989. Soviet Union dissolved itself end of 1991. So, whenever you choose to make that demarcation, after that time, Carl Schmitt has been found to be more and more interesting, more and more literature about him. Post-colonial scholars have found him extremely important. But he's a thinker who is operating from a Eurocentric perspective, conservative Catholic thinker in many ways. So we'll take note of that and see what qualifications we need to make. So in the age of imperialism, what we see is that several developments that we can note. One is, of course, the gradual separation of politics and economics that happens, which is, you practice commerce by yourself. Commerce is a non-political activity which can simply generate wealth, and the job of politics is to maintain the conditions where the merchants, the capitalists can increase wealth, the wealth of nations. Even someone like Adam Smith, right, who says this is something you can do, he is very attentive to questions of morality. Theory of moral sentiments is another text he writes, which is that when capitalism increases and we are increasing the wealth of nations, there are questions of morality which have to be, we have to pay attention to them. And customarily, secularization, right, is understood to be originating from this development. That after this, it was possible for secularism to establish itself. Right? Now, there's a complication for this claim. It is the following, that caius regio eius religio essentially meant that every nation or every kingdom was mono-religious. Right? If the king is Catholic, everybody is Catholic. King is Protestant, everybody is Protestant. So no war between Catholics and Protestants. But what about countries which are multi-religious? That was a problem that came to be addressed in the as imperialism spread out into the colonies. And which is why post-colonial theorists tend to argue that the real interesting history of secularism comes in countries like India, for example, where they are really dealing with multiple religions which are not going to fold their cards because the government says so. Yeah? So the government has to balance competing religious demands, and it cannot be outside the sphere of religion. It has to intervene. There's no option but to intervene. Western countries, by contrast, had 300 years to force all the minority religions to convert or to emigrate or to otherwise by some coercive process be eliminated. Yeah, so that is how you could have a process where they can say religion doesn't matter, but as it happens, everybody's Protestant, and the Catholics are so small in number they don't matter, which would be said in UK, for example. And this became a very powerful distinction, which served to justify the ways in which law and politics were conducted. Right? And this division of the world into civilized and uncivilized was, of course, not, it was prejudiced and discriminatory, no doubt about it. It was also untrue, as is shown by very simple facts, such as that non-Western peoples or peoples not descended from Caucasian races, so-called, were also full-fledged legal actors who engaged in treaty making with Western countries. Yeah, so the Maratha Empire would engage in treaties with the Portuguese Empire about what what kind of power sharing, how to deal with international waters, territorial disputes. Or if you take the North American continent, the Native Americans, the American Indians, the oldest treaty which is available in US records is this Treaty of Albany in 1722, where they are engaging in treaty making with American Indians about land dispute resolution, etc. So they were full-fledged actors. But by the time we come to Carl Schmitt, whose book is 1950s, he says these people are without law. They are without law, and European law does not recognize them as political actors because they are beneath the horizon of intelligibility for European law, and that European law can only apply to Christians, and it is a Christian world that is taken forward by international law. That's his argument. Yeah, and it is clearly false. Nevertheless, his argument about international law still deserves attention. So in the colonies, religion became the realm where challenges were conceived and launched against the depoliticization that imperialism demanded. But what is interesting, obviously there's a lot of history here which I'm summarizing. When anti-colonial struggles led to national independence, Westphalian international norms were invariably accepted. We can talk about India here, right? You have Gandhi, you have Nehru, people educated in, British legal system, British educational system. Gandhi's struggle, as we all know, takes religion as the medium of communication. India is one example, but really this applies to much of the post-colonial history, right? Other countries also, very similar path is followed, we can see that. And note here that the exclusion of religion was not understood as a political act, rather it was seen as evolution, right? So you have someone like Bertrand Russell, a great philosopher, says, religion belongs to the infancy of humankind, right? When you're in a primitive state, you're religious. When you grow up, you forget religion. Yeah? And of course, that's a variation of what even someone like Immanuel Kant argued, that, as Christianity itself evolves, it becomes an ethical attitude. You don't need the rituals and so forth. It's about do unto others as they would have them do unto you. That's an ethical stance, and you can dispense with all the symbolism and ritual and so forth. So secularization, therefore, was depoliticized, and we can say economic policy was also depoliticized, right? It was a matter for experts, simply a matter of increasing gross national product and, what are the technical methods through which we can do that and so forth. And today, challenges to depoliticization exist at national and international levels. Yeah? And national issues can no longer be understood and resolved purely within the nation due to technological change, market growth, etc. Yeah? So this is the kind of rationale for considering these larger questions of international order and placing questions that arise within the nation in that larger frame, right? It is through some historical discussion that contextualization can be understood best. Yeah? So this is the context in which we can say many things happen to upset this balance. We're focusing on the spread of communication, the promotion of communication as an ideal, that it did not grasp the way in which technology actually, what technology was doing. Have a short discussion of technology here. That to think that technology is an end in itself, more technology, more progress, misconceives technology. Technology is the turning of everything into a means, but for no end in particular. What is the goal of technology? It is to make itself available for whatever purpose you choose to apply it. Right? It has no goal in itself. So we can say that technology is about the turning of everything into a means, into an instrument for some other purpose. Yeah? And so, here this is drawing from Heidegger, Bernard Stiegler and so forth. Technology is that which has no end, that is, or no goal. Yeah? And if we locate this understanding within the West, which is, of course, fair, the history of the West, in terms of the history of technology, has been the infinite production of new ends. Right? What is technology for? Well, at this point, it's about mobility. At this point, it's about, growing markets. At this point, it's about, intensifying social bonds, a series of new ends. Yeah? As long ago as, Engels' texts in the late 19th century, where Engels points out that, human capacity is achieved through its interaction with tools. Our hand, our eyes, these are physical capacities which do not grow by themselves, but through engagement with tools. So we are Homo faber, we are not Homo sapiens. It is by working with tools upon the world that we achieve what we have come to regard as our distinct humanity. Now, it did not matter so much when the development of technology was, say, at the level it was in the 18th century. Roughly, historians are saying before the steam engine. The steam engine marks the break point. It's when capital, the growth of markets makes the production of new ends into a ceaseless and ever quickening process, right? And from that time onwards, cultural change begins to lag very heavily behind technological change. Very heavily behind technological change. So that is what we are confronted with. Talk about the technological problem, why we have to theorize technology and so on. It is that technology has not only lagged behind culture, but we have been encouraged to treat culture itself as a domain of nostalgia, looking backwards, idealizing the past, rather than engaging with our new handicaps and our new challenges and the possibilities of overcoming them with whatever means we have. Yeah? So, someone like Paul Lazarsfeld remarked on this long ago, 1940 or so. He says, you read the newspapers and it's very clear that They are cultivating an attitude of looking back towards the past.
Technology has its social acceptance, and most importantly, the resistance which church and other authority had against technology. So, at what time it succeeded, and what time the acceptance started happening in the Western world.
The resistance to change. And then when the change happens, it is often treated as if we have always had this view and nothing has changed. So the arrival of change is often denied, it's erased. So we have to read against the grain if we are asking the kinds of questions you're posing. When did it change and so on? It's not like they will say, on this date we decided, okay, fine, steam engines, okay, whatever it is. Uh, but we can see that somebody like, so Carl Schmitt talks about how Lenin was listening to Chamberlain in the British Parliament, famous imperialist, and Chamberlain would make these arguments that, we can solve the social question in England by sending our young people abroad. So imperialism is the answer to our social question, which is how do we deal with poverty at home? Send the poor abroad, right? Which is why we had such uh, horrendous experience with British imperialism, because we got the worst of the worst very often. Yeah. Um, so it's not that at some point they said, yes, okay, I get it. I read Heidegger, we're good. No, no, no. Something happens quite incrementally, where to this day, there's a tendency to regard technology as something external, something controlling, something compromising your humanity. Now, you could say that during the early part of the 20th century, there was a lot of interest in bringing technology into philosophy, into kind of our thinking. But there was a resistance and pushback also. And the Cold War represented the triumph of a kind of humanism, which both, for different reasons, both in Soviet Union and in the United States, led to an understanding of the human being as, in terms, exclusive of technology, right? Quite different. So, but I'll talk about the US case because that's, we are in that orbit. Uh, that if you bring in the question of technology, you're leaning towards the Soviets. Because then you open up the question of control. If you have technology, then who's controlling the technology? You must be a communist, right? So cybernetics, which was proposed as a way to break the deadlock between communism and capitalism, the cybernetics said it's not about ownership of property, private property, that's 19th century. Today it's about technology and technological control. Who controls technology? Right? The manager may control technology. You don't have to own it. That is the problem that we have to face. How do you control? How democratic can it be? How are you going to manage, the inclusion of people in technology? But the technological question was suppressed during the Cold War. In fact, we can say that the Cold War represented this lost opportunity, evasion of the fundamental questions, choosing instead to fight a bygone battle, right? And perhaps it is more in the current time where we are coming closer to an acknowledgement that technology is something that, unless we theorize it, it is truly going to marginalize human beings themselves. I think that, the fears about AI, and now it's a race. It's a race between those who want to take AI forward and those who want to just, hit a pause and try to enable some social controls. Uh,
Yeah, so just to kind of add to that, there's a very interesting kind of argument that the development of the abortion rights, the resistance to abortion rights has to do a lot with the development of the ultrasound.
Yes.
So that's a very, so I think there is also a a case to be made about the clubbing of science and technology, which is where the science part of
What do you mean clubbing of science?
so we often kind of now in increasingly in academic spaces, you would often see uh, political leaders kind of openly saying science and technology,
Yes.
and not treating them as something that could have their own specific or ideological ends. So for example, while science is something that questions or poses a challenge to religion, technology might not is more malleable. So I would and even during the 80s when the I don't know if you've seen the series, it's called Mrs. America. It's a very interesting web series which actually talks about how one woman kind of led the Reagan campaign and made it. I mean, it's a very interesting kind of look at what that during the 70s the conservatives and the liberals was not something that was exclusive to one party or the other. Like both Republicans and Democrats had both conservatives and liberals. And during the 80s, what happened is this movement by this woman, I'm forgetting the name of the woman, using recordings of suburban women kind of openly speaking against the feminist Gloria Steinem kind of feminism, and kind of mobilizing the suburban women along and taking along this kind of idea of abortion as a baby killing thing, and using recordings, using tapes to circulate. So it's a very interesting kind of look at how technology can actually be used, and it's actually now it's fairly established that technology there is no necessary emancipation in technology. So
World War One and World War Two brought science and technology together, so-called big science. But as late as 1940, 1948, science was overwhelmingly socialist. That's something we just have to put on the historical record. If you were a scientist, you were socialist. And when Julian Huxley was declared to be the head of the UNESCO, United Nations Educational, it was initially the Educational and Cultural Organization. He put the S in UNESCO. There must be science also. But, he was left-leaning. All his friends were maybe more left-leaning than him. And that changed after World War II, the 50s, more and more criticized science. And of course, funding was essential for most scientific research projects. And so that ensured that you didn't express your opinions. So if you had them, what did it matter? Nobody knew what your opinions were. So that tends to be the situation. You can say there's always politics, but they can be understood in such different ways. So say, let us take traditional caste society. What is politics in traditional caste society? Well, those who have rights can exercise them. Those who don't have rights, well, they have to do their duties and negotiate within whatever space is available to them. It is hardly politics in the way we understand it today, which is a common realm. So I'm just following convention here, since we have very little time to explore, elementary aspects of the development of politics over, centuries and so forth. To say that this general sphere of politics, Sarvasadharan Janta, the idea that anyone can be part of it, we can locate that in the sort of national struggle, freedom struggle. And you would be right to say, what about earlier Bhakti movement and so on? Yes, those are, I can't go into that here. But what is depoliticization? Depoliticization is rendering inadmissible the expression of common interests regarding whatever subject, whether it's religion, whether it's law, whether it's, economy, the discouragement. And to this day, you can say something, you can ask a question and they'll say, I'm sorry, you're being political. And that's the end. You just have to shut up because everybody says, why are you being political? We're not political. So, political has become a kind of word that can kill your question. So that shows that we are not very far away from this domain of depoliticization. It is all around us. Yeah. And it is a constant struggle. And here I would see there are different conceptions, different definitions of politics. So let me just say that briefly. Yeah, that Jacques Rancière is, I think, very helpful here. Yeah, that what Rancière says is politics is precisely what is not allowed by your procedures. That is politics. Your procedures are designed to reproduce a situation, to keep it running, to make sure that the trains run on time and the policemen are getting their salary and, the lawmakers are getting their PA, DA and BATA and so forth. It is not actually helping Sarvasadaran Janata. Only by breaking those procedures or challenging them can you have the possibility of politics. That's a Jacobin understanding of politics, which Jacques Rancière provides. That's quite an influential idea this time. Yeah, I'll mention two other ideas of politics just for contextualization. One is the republican notion of politics. It is the ancient Greek, that you can only have politics as the member of a republic. And if you are expelled from the republic, you lose the right to politics. When Socrates was charged with the crime of corrupting the minds of youth, he had two choices. He could flee Athens. He was free. Nobody stopped him. Or he could swallow poison. But he expressed his, he didn't want to live outside Athens. You fast forward to several, 1,500 years, Machiavelli, he was expelled from Florence. Expelled from Florence, he did not want to, it was Florence where he had his life. Florence, that was, the Republic gave his life meaning. Yeah. So that republican understanding of politics comes to be changed in the modern era. Actually, so here I'll mention the third definition of politics, which is by Carl Schmitt. And that you may all know. Yeah. Again, very influential definition of politics. Yeah, which is that, he's basically, again, he's a critic of liberalism. And what he's saying is liberalism has removed any genuine politics. It's all about rules. And it seems that there's no issue of politics at all. And his response is, yes, there is politics. We have to remember, we cannot afford to lose the idea of politics, because politics is what tells you who is your friend and who is your enemy. And the opposition between friend and enemy, that is politics. Okay, so different understandings of politics are there. Jacobin, Republican, Schmittian. I have here some things that, may not be necessary for this class, but I've used it in the past, that the evidence of our senses has to be completed with our imagination in order to actually arrive at ideas about the world that we can utilize. And these are, perceptual, if you look at it one way, it's a young lady. Look at it another way, it's an old lady. Yeah. You look at this one way, it's a cup. You look at it another way, it's two faces in shadow looking at each other. Yeah. And you can't see both of these simultaneously. With one idea, you can see one image. With another idea, you can see another image. So it's a very clear illustration that it is the imagination that completes the evidence of the senses. Evidence of the senses is not uh, freestanding. It cannot establish our knowledge of the world independently without our imagination acting upon it. Yeah? Now at this point I wanted to move to the American century. I thought that would be the most approachable text, then talk about Fareed Zakaria, and then we can talk about Carl Schmitt. Yeah, so Henry Luce makes this argument about soft power, what we later comes to be called soft power. He provides an argument for American dominance. He was born of Protestant missionary parents in China, so he had this idea that America can do good, and American spirit is something very special that has to be encouraged, that Americans have a mission to lead the world, to show the world their values, to create the world in their own image. And this is said about it that it anticipated and exploited the trends of globalization before most other, certainly media organs, saw them coming. So in a way they were forward-looking, even if they were politically conservative. And some of the arguments that he makes here are worth going over very quickly, very briefly. That whereas America was the most powerful nation in the world, Americans were unable to accommodate themselves spiritually and practically to the fact of their power. They shrank away from exercising their influence in the world stage. They were not interested in engaging with the rest of the world. Yeah? And Hannah Arendt has also written about this in her book on revolutions. And her text was written as part of a lot of conversations that came up in the early Cold War period, which were all focused on what is the meaning of America in the world. Yeah? That they had to craft some message, some ideology, some program, and there was an uncertainty about how to do it, because all of the older programs for world leadership were based on racial superiority, civilizational greatness, and the impulse on the American side was to say no to that. Probably eventually they landed in the same place. See, after World War I, the first professor became President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. He happened to be a political scientist, and he had all these ideas about a new world order. And Congress, US Congress, resoundingly rejected all of his plans. And not only did the US not enter the League of Nations, but Woodrow Wilson himself died an early death. Yeah. But what the Congress expressed here was a long-standing view in the US that US need not engage in world politics, that free trade was enough. And what that meant, of course, was that Europe can engage in politics and US can live in its shadow, yeah, or have some kind of coexistence with Europe. This was also seen in the Monroe Doctrine, which Carl Schmitt writes quite a bit about. Right? So in 1824, the Monroe Doctrine is issued. Basically it says there is a longitudinal line, and any other nation that crosses this longitudinal line and enters the Americas, North America, Central America, South America, they claimed the whole continental landmass, that will be treated as an act of aggression against the United States. We will not allow it. We will treat it as an act of war. Yeah, and so this was already the mark of, you could say, an imperial intention. Yeah? You cannot say this is apolitical by any means. They were a growing imperial interest, but they had not matured. They had not achieved confidence about exercising their power as yet on the global stage at this time. So Henry Luce says, the 20th century is the American century. Ours is also a revolutionary century. It has now become common to say this. Of course, the Chinese revolution is still ahead, 8 years ahead. But the Russian revolution has happened, and despite their best efforts, let's remember, not that they just said, okay, have your revolution. They waged war on Russia. People like Churchill said, we must strangle this baby in its cradle. There were massive military assistance given to the White Russians who resisted the revolution. But as it happened, the Bolshevik Party won, and Russian Revolution endured. And the United States actually helped in their industrialization programs. Right? Magnitogorsk, the major steel production, was through US loans. But after the Cold War, it became, after World War II, that kind of assistance absolutely ended, and the hostility became much, much greater. Yeah? But here, Luce is asking, what internationalism have we Americans to offer? Ours cannot come out of the vision of any one man. It must be the product of the imaginations of many men. It must be a sharing with all peoples of our Bill of Rights, our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, our magnificent industrial products, our technical skills. And then he says, it must be an internationalism of the people, by the people, and for the people. Okay, so you can observe the contradictions here, but this is the kind of argument that is being made. Yeah, that must simultaneously be international, but the internationalism in its wisdom must embrace the American Bill of Rights, etc. Once we cease to distract ourselves with lifeless arguments about isolationism, yeah, what Luce is referring here is that there were the isolationists, there were the exceptionalists. Isolationists said, we don't care about the rest of the world. We simply want to improve our republic. And it is true. They paid great attention to creating a system of government where powers were delegated and devolved to the local level. And if you compare it to, say, the French Revolution, where the opposite happened, there was great centralization. Compare it to Russia, you compare it to China, again, enormous centralization. The wisdom of the US approach in that respect cannot be denied. They built a system where power was delegated. They tried to avoid, the dangers of centralized power, etc. And he says, we should be amazed to discover there's already an immense American internationalism. Okay, so here he is basically saying the love for American cultural products equals internationalism. Which we can puzzle over that claim. Yeah, we can puzzle over it. He says American jazz, Hollywood movies, American slang, American machines and patented products are in fact the only things that every community in the world, from Zanzibar to Hamburg, recognizes in common. Yeah? There is nothing else that joins the world except American products. He is making this argument. And of course, as a media baron, in a sense, he is in that domain. So he knows something about what he's talking about, even if we treat the claim as an exaggerated one. Blindly, unintentionally, accidentally, and really in spite of ourselves, we are already a world power in all the trivial ways, in very human ways. But there is a great deal more than that. America is already the intellectual, scientific, and artistic capital of the world. But essentially, Luce is pointing to a new kind of power that is not political. It's a byproduct of military and economic power. We can call it cultural. Based on information, ideas, images, travel through the air. As mentioned, this came to be called soft power. And of course, this echoes a famous idea in US foreign policy. Theodore Roosevelt: speak softly and carry a big stick, you'll go far. Coercion was always involved. And as a latecomer to a world dominated by Europe, the US developed a new approach. It demanded access, but not territorial control. Access to markets, access to sell their goods, to buy raw materials. They wanted the power to penetrate boundaries so that their organizations could function in foreign countries. And this new approach was distinct from European powers who made no secret of what they believed was their civilizational superiority. Yeah? You must learn their language, you must learn their culture. By contrast, the US sought influence but not domination. Yeah? They had no interest in taking over and ruling. And their use of military bases offers a hint. When the US planted military bases overseas, Daniel Immerwahr has recently made this point, but I don't believe it's a new one. Those other nations retained supreme sovereignty, so we had the Clark and Subic military bases in the Philippines. Popular protests demanded that those bases be shut. They were shut. I mean, there was some debate about it, but the relationship between US and Philippines is not substantially changed. Just we'll find other ways, but military bases can come, they can go. It's not a problem. It was not like an anti-colonial struggle. In other words, military power and political power could be treated separately. You didn't have to always keep them in close alliance with each other. This is the US style. Yeah, a new style of world influence, different from the earlier powers. Access for its goods, freedom to penetrate borders and function within them, no responsibility to rule or to oversee nation building. So here we can maybe move on to the Zakaria essay, which I think is a nice one. Zakaria, you may know, was a student of Samuel Huntington, so also a son of Rafiq Zakaria. So he had this kind of Indian nationalist side to his background. And if you ask the Soviets, I have former Soviet colleagues, Boris Groys, and once I said, I think the Soviet Union lost the war. He said, no, they did not lose the war. We dissolved ourselves. How could we lose the war? We dissolved ourselves. So here you have a war where the two sides even disagree about who won and who lost. Okay, there has never been a more mysterious war, which is why we can say this was a metaphysical war. It was not an ordinary war. It was a war you had to be informed by experts that there is a war. And you had to be taught to look for the signs. If they have some, hammer and sickle, they could be communist, you watch out, In America, they had all these hysterical campaigns. There are Reds under Hollywood beds, and all this kind of, the hysteria of Cold War witch hunting. So many people, thousands of people lost their jobs, people committed suicide, etc., careers destroyed. And when it was over, by that time, they did not understand what they had done. So this is also kind of the irony of the Cold War. Yeah, there was a triumphalism, but Farid Zakaria tells us actually the triumphalism was not very much until much later. That, it was they were not like celebrating so much. They did not know what they had won. They had forgotten what the Cold War did achieve was that, you had two worldviews that were clashing. Soviet worldview was collective control of the means of production. American worldview was private property, private control of the means of production. And this was a clearly political view. You could have clearly argued, okay, you're saying collective, can we talk about it? What collective? Collective in this way, syndicalist, some other kind of, communitarian form of ownership. There could have been a dialogue. In fact, there was a refusal of dialogue. The only way in which it could be fought was war. So the clash of worldviews was essentially understood as revealing the military character of essential reality. Essential reality was military, and you had to seek military input to respond to the nature of problems in the international order. And this corresponds to the other facet, which Schmidt also acknowledges, which is that international law was depoliticized. It was national law that was most important. International law was just secondary, minor matters, technical issues. International law was not, it was a niche subject actually, because the world order appeared to be stable. Which is why many commentators have said, and I've made this argument, that Cold War was a zombie war. It is just going on. Because it is metaphysical, there is no point at which you can say, here's the evidence that we need to stop the war. First it's communists, then it's Islamicists, then it's other terrorists, and the military-industrial complex, which was identified by President Eisenhower in his farewell address. You can find it on TV. You have to beware of the military-industrial complex. This is the American general who led the war, the army that won World War II. He is saying to the American population, beware of the military-industrial complex. Okay? He saw that the kind of influence they are exercising, and that influence has only grown today. It's only grown. Yeah. So the mindset of that the essential nature of world order is a military reality which only the military can properly respond to, very much remains with us today. Yeah, that was it took shape in the early Cold War period. It was a ability of the military to influence politics at the time, and the extent to which the academy was funded by, military, social science research, scientific research was funded by the military to an enormous extent. 90% is one estimate I've seen. Yeah, so they were able to influence thinking such that, ordinary people did not touch on questions of international order, certainly Cold War, communism, forget it. Right? It's not addressed at all. And in a way, it's, but so after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Americans wanted to go home, and they did. Okay, I just want to pause on this statement. It's written by Farid Zakaria, who's from Bombay. He knows this is a provincial culture that he's writing for. They are not interested in the rest of the world. They want to just, be in their own place, have their own people around them, and their interest in understanding other societies is limited. Yeah, it's limited. Now he says, they stayed deeply interested in all these things, but by the 1990s, it had lost interest in the world. Foreign news plummeted. After the end of the Cold War, foreign news essentially, so people, there was not audience demand, and they did not try to cultivate audience demand. Would say they should have done that. A responsible news media would have cultivated interest in foreign media, foreign news. They did not do so. Zakaria goes on. Ever since the end of World War I, the US has wanted to transform the world. The 1990s, that seemed more possible than ever. Countries across the planet were moving toward the American way. The Gulf War seemed to mark a new milestone for world order, in that it was prosecuted to uphold a norm, which is Iraq invaded Kuwait. So territorial sovereignty, limited in its scope, endorsed by major powers, legitimized by international law. But right at the time of these positive developments, the United States lost interest. US policymakers still wanted to transform the world, but on the cheap. They did not have the political capital or resources to throw themselves into the effort. That was one reason why Washington's advice was always the same: economic shock therapy and instant democracy. Anything slower or more complex, anything, in other words, that resembled the manner in which the West itself had liberalized its economy and democratized its politics, which took them 300 years. 200, 300 years was unacceptable. Jaldi lao, was the attitude. Before 9/11, when confronting challenges, the American tactic was mostly to attack from afar. Hence, the twin approaches of economic sanctions and precision airstrikes. Both of these, as Elliot Cohen has written, had the characteristics of modern courtship, gratification without commitment. Yeah? It doesn't work, just fold up and leave. Afghanistan. US foreign policy was defined by the rhetoric of transformation, but the reality of accommodation. Yeah? Laissez-faire, actually. Laissez-faire came to be adopted in their foreign policy once US hegemony was secured. Now, here I want to transition to Carl Schmitt. And I have some sections from the text which I'll draw your attention to and go over. But just a little bit prefatory note, bit of a prefatory note to what I already said. So he sees three broad phases in international law. The first phase, and you can say it's a thoroughly materialist understanding of the developments in international law. The first phase is when land is the territorial quality of land is what shapes the limit and extent of law. Yeah? So territorial land-based empires in Europe, China, other parts of Asia, where your power as a sovereign goes all the way down to the bottom of the earth and all the way up to the top of the heavens. That was the understanding, that it is rooted in the soil and is a kind of, it has a durable quality. It's not something that can melt away or be shared with other entities. It's a form of indivisible control, you could say. The features of land-based law become clearer when we see the transition to what he calls sea-based law, right, which arrives with the so-called discovery of America and the beginning of naval expeditions to exploit the wealth of the Americas, competition between European powers to exploit the wealth of the Americas, in which competition England, one of the smallest nations in Europe, defeats Germany, defeats Holland, defeats Spain, defeats Portugal, defeats France, becomes the supreme power. Yeah? And the nature of the law is shaped by the medium through which it is expressed. That's Schmitt's contention. Yeah? So, in sea-based law, the rights that you can exercise, that you can claim, are unlimited. So the first proponent of international law, Hugo Grotius, a Dutch theorist, makes the argument that in encounters at sea, finders keepers. So there is a Spanish armada carrying wealth from the Americas. You can attack them. Fine. If you kill them all, take the property, fine. So the international law, in a sense, legalized piracy, which was the demand of the age, that, these were competitive powers that sought to maximize their advantage with all this enormous wealth gushing in from the New World. Yeah? And it changed the balance of power in Europe, because now the small nation, England, was able to rule the seas. It had no competitors. It demolished all its competition. And the sea-based rule was it is what enabled the transition from pre-industrial to an industrial economy, yeah, with the flow of raw materials from far away, the ability to ship raw materials and finished products across different parts of the world was essential to the undergirding the reproduction of maritime law, or an international order based on maritime power. Yeah, this was maritime power at work. Now, both in this domain of land law and sea law, Schmidt argues, we had a European, the European jus publicum, European Christian international law was what was actually operative. This is what Schmidt argues, and that can obviously be tweaked and it has been challenged, but that's not our point of contention here. My interest is the transition from the sea-based to the next phase. What comes after that? And he makes suggestions about it, but he doesn't pursue it fully, except I think in some passage which I've tried to find here, which is the domain of air. So land, sea, and air. Yeah, three sort of material bases of the different phases of international law. So with American power, we have a form of law based on control over the air. Yeah, and that, so each, if it's land, there are certain, the fact that it is based on territorial control has certain problems, certain opportunities, certain constraints. Sea-based law, a different set of, constraints. So, from 3 miles off the coast, there is any activity is going to be monitored by the nation whose coast is in question. But 3 miles away from the coast, more than that, it's international law. You can have piracy there. You can do anything that's allowed by international law. The law of the air is not mentioned in these terms because it is not formulated. It's not formulated. Yeah, so the change is not quite acknowledged. Yeah, so we have to try to say, we have to be a little more speculative in this phase because there has been a hesitancy to spell out what this shift means. These are maybe part of the kind of the liberal, unwillingness to acknowledge the fact of power and the preference for a kind of maybe more neutral way of understanding these transformations. But with the domain of the air, which begins, you could say, with aerial bombardment, inaugurated in World War I, and of course the telegraph, the wireless transmission, which had already begun mid-19th century, which becomes much more important in the 20th century, radio, television, etc. We have a new form of control exemplified with the United States, where territorial control is not the issue any longer. Yeah, that was the US approach. That we want access, we want the ability to penetrate boundaries, which is why the free flow of information became so important. We need to be able to influence the information base that people have access to, because then that will win them over to our side, because it was a missionary approach in the sense that, we have the right ideas, we have the right attitudes, and everybody should have our attitudes, which we can see in the Henry Luce document, American Century. Yeah? Now, with this set of developments, now, as Schmidt is saying, in this maritime age, and which is roughly the modern age, you could say, which is also the age of the Westphalian Treaty. It's the age of separation of church and state. It's the age of free trade. It's the age of laissez-faire, of the separation of economics and politics, the depoliticization of economy, depoliticization of religion, the depoliticization of international law, the assumption that it is in national law that the truly political, urgent political concerns are to be addressed. With this transition from sea-based law to air-based law, there is a growing inadequacy. There's a growing inadequacy and a kind of lag between technological developments, economic developments, and you can say philosophical, cultural understanding and their manifestation in law. That's very clear, and in a way that's kind of one of the stimuli for Schmitt's text. So let me give you a few passages here. It's from the appendix. Marx adopted and emphasized the progressivist claim to the unlimited increase in production essential to progressive liberalism. Okay? So what he's saying here is, you could say, the Nehruvian assumption also, talk about India, which is technological growth will, with economic policy, which is not a political matter, lead to enough for everybody. It will solve our social, economic problems, and the most progressive, the most radical economic thinkers believed there was no limit to production, there was no limit to the benefits that would follow from technological development. And what Schmitt is doing here is showing how that is a false assumption, that it leads to problems. And here is his argument. Marx thus was able to treat the question of division and distribution as a later concern. So he focused on production, socialization of the means of production. Distribution, all that will take care of itself once you control means of production. He concentrated the whole weight of his attack on the expropriation of the expropriators, that is, on the procedure of appropriation, exploitation in the workplace, in place of the old right of plunder and of the primitive land appropriations of pre-industrial times. He substituted appropriation of the total means of production, the great modern industry appropriation. This raised the obvious question of how to proceed with the concrete division and distribution of new chances of appropriation. This raised the obvious question of how to proceed with the concrete division and distribution of new chances of appropriation, because expropriation of the old owners opens up new and enormous possibilities of appropriation. Although extremely interesting, this obvious question no longer is being answered concretely. It is simply rejected as unscientific, even as the concrete question of the continuation and form of the unlimited increase in production following the great industry appropriation is left unanswered. Of course, plundering should stop, but appropriation as a precondition of new distributions does not. If the essence of imperialism lies in the precedence of appropriation before distribution and production, then a doctrine such as the expropriation of the expropriators is obviously the strongest imperialism because it is the most modern. Okay? So he's explaining why those arguments which said we need to make sure that you are distributing the wealth properly, have a universal basic income, make sure that there's social welfare, those are not seen as cutting to the root of the issue in the way that the Marxist analysis was, because it is in production that actually the wealth is generated. You attack a point of production, that is the strongest mode of response and therefore the most modern. Everything on earth based on progress and development in both East and West now contains at its core a concrete and precise creed. These principles of belief proclaim that the Industrial Revolution leads to an immeasurable increase in production. As a consequence, appropriation becomes outmoded, even criminal, and division is no longer a problem given the abundance. There is only production, only the problemless fortune of pure consumption. written in the early 1950s. No longer are there wars and crises because unchained production no longer is partial and unilateral but has become total and global. In other words, like the bees, there is a whole kind of economic theory around Homo Faber modeling on the bees. Mankind finally has found its formula in the beehive. Things govern themselves. Okay? Man confronts himself, wandering in the wilderness of alienation has ended. In a world created by man for himself, a world of men for men, doesn't say women, we can say it. Unfortunately, sometimes against men, man can give without taking. Okay? So he's outlining here something that in a way can be seen as the ideology of the age of communication, yeah, where abundance is such has reached such an extent that appropriation is not required any longer. It can be treated as criminal, right? Intellectual property, for example, you can take what I have. I'm not diminished in the least by it. Everybody can take. There is no diminution whatsoever. There's no zero-sum game. Yeah? So in the age of communication, we can have a different conception of politics, which leads to questions that we have not addressed before. Okay? Man confronts himself. Wandering in the wilderness of alienation has ended. And what we find in this context is the solutions that had worked for an earlier era, the age of neutralization and depoliticization, those solutions are no longer adequate to the context that we are dealing with here. Let me give you one example. Yeah? So, in the age of neutralization and depoliticization, which Smith is also written about, there is a shift from questions of politics to questions of morality. Yeah? It's increasingly the moral sphere that problems are posed and are believed to be capable of resolution. That is a problem which in a way took its shape, and here we are talking about the European context, because the opposition to monarchical absolutism as it took shape in 17th, 18th century Europe was responding to the refusal of politics by the monarch and the claim that in a sense there was no possibility of dialogue between the monarchical or aristocratic claim of privilege and the democratic or enlightenment claim of right. Consequently, this is an argument that Reinhard Koselleck has made. Consequently, Enlightenment politics was infused by a moralism which was in a sense the mirror image of monarchical absolutism, which is to say there was no dialogue possible within the political arguments that were used to oppose aristocratic privilege. It became a moral absolutism masquerading as politics. That's the kind of argument that Reinhard Koselleck makes. And I think that in fact, Reinhard Koselleck was a student of Schmitt. Okay, so he's sort of elaborating this point. So that when we have the post-World War New Order, and it seems like there is a community of nations. First it's 45, then it's 50, then it's 100. Now it's 193 nations, community of nations, the United Nations. But what are the politics that are able to be expressed in the United Nations? Well, it's very difficult, right? United Nations is a talking shop, but when it comes to being a working body, its actions are limited, and the tendency is to define politics, it continues, right? The tendency is to define political problems as moral problems. We can see that in the Nuremberg trial, we can see that in Justice Jackson's speech. These are crimes against humanity. Okay? So when you define international problems as crimes against humanity, then all of humanity is one block. And whoever is opposing humanity is the criminal against whom anything can be done, because it is an absolute form of transgression for which absolute punishment, absolute reprisal is fully justified. Yeah? And that that continues very much today, you could say that. Yeah. So, I'll pause here because this is the conclusion of this segment of the discussion, and open to questions.
In the article, he says the post 9/11, the American response to terrorism
Yes.
was fundamentally very different compared to, let's say, Europe's reaction to the terrorism, because US was Europe was facing this problem from quite some time. So,
Which problem, sorry?
terrorism.
Yes. You're referring to. Look, terrorism is a political term, so please clarify.
So, post 9/11, when America witnessed attacks, and then the response which was given to the entire thing and the plan of action which was planned, that response was fundamentally very different from the way Europe was handling so-called terrorism issue. So, I want to understand what are the factors which was responsible for, was created this particular response which was given by USA, and why it was fundamentally very different compared to the other parts of the world who were also grappling with the similar issue.
Yeah, right. Now, I am sort of scouring the archives to try to answer your question, which is also in a way my question. And the I can see that a number of factors converged here, and I'm not able to say, apart from what I discussed yesterday, which is fear of communism as spurring a kind of mobilizing of forces after the end of World War II, you know, on a kind of military basis but without a declared war, to essentially weaponize all civil society institutions to ensure that the United States will stay ahead in this war against an enemy that was an absolute enemy, whose cooperation was essential to the victory in World War II, turned into this unyielding hostility with which no truck or compromise could be made. Yeah, so that kind of politicization led to the weaponization of institutions and technologies on a scale that had not been ever done before. Here I'm focusing on communication because it has been the most neglected and also the most subject to ideological erasure. Yeah, because it was, they trivialized the idea of communication, they banalized it, they said it's, nothing is happening there. So there was a whole industry, you know it very well, FX research, and their main result that they reported was, as you know, no effect. Okay, so whole industry of FX research, all they had to say was, well, we wasted our time. And you could ask, well, why were you wasting it? Why do you continue to waste our time? But you know, it served an ideological purpose, which is to downscale the question of communication into small empirical questions which appear to be answerable, rather than larger questions of social organization, which were plainly demanded to be answered, because now you had technologies that were connecting parts of the world which had previously not been connected at all, and they required coordination. They required some kind of regulation vis-a-vis each other, which was being done, but which could not be discussed under the rubric of communication. And that is shown, for example, the fact that you have people like Willard Rowland, who has written about this. Why is it that communication policy is not a subject that American scholars are interested in. He's, written a lot about it. The communication policy is something we need to understand and study and promote. But, there was never any interest in it. So the persistent treatment of this connecting thread as one that did not require any input from the scholarly community, and in fact was subject to, expert treatment that was not made public very often. So we know this, that from the beginning of the Cold War, more and more and more records were produced, more than we could ever read and process, but more and more and more records were also withdrawn from the domain of accessibility, permanently unavailable. So we are dealing with a history that is, in a sense, harder and harder, therefore, to understand, which is why then we have to talk about people like Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, and Panama Papers, because it is through the leak, which is itself regarded as unlawful, as, unpatriotic, as, American historians who deal in the domain of diplomacy and information refuse to talk about any of these people, which is astonishing to me. They refuse to talk about them because they are treated as criminal without saying, well, why are they criminal? They followed the rules, which is they're making public information which was designed to be public. It's government information. How can you treat them as criminals? So we run into a lot of problems to properly answer the questions you're posing. We are therefore have to speculate.
As media itself is creating those territory of influencing also. Like, can we also say is that what
Sure.
Smith called nomos, like media itself is nomos in today's time also. And
Yeah.
I'll continue.
So in the text that I assigned, the different part of the text that I told you to read, several places Schmidt says law is in essence mediation. Law is essence mediation. So if we take that further, I think we can say that media is law. It's flipped around. Media is law. So, which is a point also made by someone like Avital Ronell, without reference to any of these literatures or debates. So, and it's plain to see that you can create an imaginative realm of one kind through, media control, and it can change overnight also. Firstly, that the road not taken is not a road that we can ignore. It's still a road that we have to think about very seriously. And the other thing is that the United States' mode of imperialism was always was not consistent or homogeneous one internally. It was filled with denial and disavowal. And we see that manifest in the post 9/11. Why do they hate us? We are such sweet people. This kind of thing. And I staged a conference in NYU shortly after 9/11 for America and its others, funded by my university. Believe it or not, the university refused to publicize it because the publicity department saying, what others? What do you mean others? As if it was all America and there can be no others. So, these are some of the contradictions. No imperial powers without its contradictions. Even in the UK, Raymond Williams has written, or Gauri Vishwanathan has written about, there is no imperialism in British literature. It is absent. It's offshore, out of sight, out of mind. That's it. The world's leading empire, at the time. I think that is the Marxist, the loss of community, loss of relationship to process of production, to your fellow beings, the turning of every use value into exchange value, to means for accumulating exchange value. that leads to a severing of social bonds, which is alienation. Yeah? All that is solid melts into air.